Welcome everybody to this week's WPI System Dynamics Collective Learning Meeting, which we are also co-hosting with the System Dynamics Society Economics Special Interest Group. Please remember to mute your microphones unless you want to ask a question. Please use the raise hand feature, which you can find by clicking on the participants button. Feel free to also use the chat box. If you type a question there, I, Christine Tang, can ask the question for you. Now I'll turn this over to Professor Mike Redzicki, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Christine. Hello to everybody. And I'd just like to briefly describe Roberto's background. He is a researcher and fellow of the Global Sustainability Institute at Anglia Ruskin University in the UK. He's the Chief Innovation Officer of ExoShock Limited, a systemic risk analysis company based on his research. And his background is in industrial engineering. His research interests lie in system dynamics modeling of industrial policies and the analysis of financial risk and sustainability. Now, what I'd like to do real quickly as well is I'm gonna elbow in here, and I'm going to share my screen briefly here. I just wanted to show Roberto has a book that he has written. Well, he has co-authored apparently, and it I'm guessing is a detailed presentation of the sorts of stuff he's going to talk about today. Although I could be wrong on that, so I await his lecture. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn things over to Roberto.
Good. Thank you very much, Mike, for your presentation, also for advertising my book. So let me share my screen, and here we are. So we have about, the presentation is made up for about 30 minutes plus discussion. So I'm happy for people to interrupt any time so that we can stay in 1 hour. So in this presentation, starting from the book as Mike was describing, I'm going to talk basically about the ERRE simulation model. The ERRE stands for Economic Risk Resource Environment, that I'm going to talk through this presentation. And what I want to show, just for this half an hour, was the problem of dealing with the economic theory for system dynamics modelers that I end up like dealing a lot during my path as a PhD and postdoc in the UK. So the presentation, first would like to speak about myself just quickly, just to give you the understanding of where I'm coming from, what I've been doing. And then I will give a quick overview of what the book is all about, which basically is the simulation model, where it comes from. And then we open up with the presentation the way we were looking for. So I first talk about the problem fundamental question that I'm trying to address in this presentation, that of course they're not completely addressed until like one solves completely the economic problem. So it's also a question for everybody to think about and to look at the end of this presentation. And then we talk about the ERRE model, in particular about two elements. So two parts. One is basically the chapter 5 of the book that Michael was talking about, which is kind of a richer type of book. And then I will present a lot of the online appendixes, which are mainly made freely online, so you can access them as much as you like. So I will talk a little bit about the background system boundaries, differences between the ERRE model and the PhD thesis of John Sterman. That's where my model comes from. And then I will talk about the economics behind the ERRE model structures. And then we conclude with take-home messages and feedback. So starting from myself, what I'm doing at the moment is to work at the Global Sustainability Institute at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. And I'm part of a project called Economics of Energy Innovation and System Transition, which is basically a large consortium made up of 16 universities between China, India, Brazil, UK, Europe. And we try to cope with the way in which we should be modeling energy innovation to make sure that we get to the zero carbon targets by 2030, 50, or whatever we manage to do that. And we are dealing with all of these countries at the same time. So one of the elements I'm doing there is really thinking a lot about I'm the representative of System Dynamics in the UK at the moment for this particular project. And then we'll look a lot about the economics. So even the economic theory that links that to System Dynamics. So one thing I did before doing this for about 1 year was like taking care about this exoshock, what they was talking about, what Mike was talking about. So exoshock basically is something that came up of my PhD and postdoc, in the sense that my PhD started in 2014. Project called Global Observatory Project was about building a gigantic, so basically a large agent-based and system dynamics model hybrid system, where the system dynamics was myself with limits to growth, and then a colleague was doing an agent-based, we're looking at political fragility, and then I end up into the Center for Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, which is my postdoc, where from the model I built in the PhD, I could expand that, looking a lot about the economic theory, trying to build up a new narrative to basically change the way policymakers, in particular in the UK, think about sustainability. And somehow that Center for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity built up my ExoShock project, which also is the same that I'm building up at the moment, which is a multi-country global risk system dynamics model. As a background from that, I'm simply an industrial engineer that I love to do all the time. And I basically coming from Italy. So background of the book, background of the ERRE model. So the ERRE model started in 2014 in my PhD, Global Resource Observatory Project under Ruskin University. And then I built up on CASP, creating a multi-country framework out of the model of the PhD. So the PhD model was based mainly on two particular models that I could get my hands on at the time. One is the limits of growth World3 model, the last version of 2003. And one was the PhD thesis of John Sterman, which is focused on the energy transition, the economic model. So the general purpose of the system it was building was to kind of putting together the limits of growth concept, so the planetary limits in the financial system. So putting the two models together could help out quite a lot to think about that. And what it is in text is a global aggregate impact assessment model to catch the systemic risk emerging from interactions between economic growth and environmental limits, with the idea also of putting some shocks in the system. The book was published, the model is there, and all the equation you can just go look for myself on the Andrew Ruskin website, and you can get the model online is there, and you can get the documentation. So what I want to talk about today, based on this experience, so we think about, for example, one of the core principles of system dynamics, which is dynamics are generated by the endogenous feedback structure of the system. Of course, this is probably one of the core, most important elements that distinguishes system dynamics from the other type of economic method. And then if we go into simply the definition, just what a system dynamics modeling should be doing is to catch some sort of system that has some dynamic, as the expression says. Of course, system dynamics, like historically came from industrial dynamics, became a bit more focused on social science, the paper of Forster, 1971. But in practice, when we speak about system dynamics today, everything that is dynamic and is a system is something we can catch and call that particular way. So we can call that continuous time approach, yes, but also the free time, why not? That's possible as a system dynamics model. Can be deterministic structure, but why not a non-deterministic one? Why don't we include some agent-based in that? Is also a dynamic system in there. And at the end of the day, everything which includes feedbacks and complexity can be considered some sort of system dynamics model. I think we can agree with that. So there comes the problem that when you go talk to economic thinking, that was at least my expertise coming from, as I said, an industrial background, which I didn't know much about economics before. In this particular way, since system dynamics can be applied to everything, you end up in a position in which you can model pretty much every kind of economic thinking using system dynamics, which is on one side is an amazing thing. On the other hand, you end up in a problem that if you go to look a little bit about economics, you find easily that different economic schools, they fight among each other, they kill each other, they hate each other, they all want to influence policy with different assumptions, and they just don't agree among each other. And the result is that if you have a system dynamics model, which for whatever reason catch more of these theories together in the same framework, because the method of system dynamics is basically this top-down idea of building whatever you can think of, you end up in a big problem because it's going to be very hard to influence a policy unless you have a clear identity in whatever economic theory, on which side you want to put yourself in. So we can think about the approach of system dynamics with the economists, like the elephant is the system dynamics model, and the economists that fight among each other are the blind men. And that's what the way we can look at this problem. So when we go in detail of the question I want to address in this presentation is literally how to build an economic system dynamics model that does not contradict itself when you start embedding different theories, different economic theories inside of it, in particular when these theories disagree among each other. So this becomes a serious problem that destroys sometimes the idea of influencing policy directly using a system dynamics model. So what I want to do is simply to transfer, or at least speak about what I could learn out of my path in building an ERRE model and doing the thing I've been doing. And so the two main questions I want to look at is why system dynamics can be considered as agreeing with more school of economics, and in particular I'm going to look at behavioral economics, evolutionary economics, post-Keynesian economics, ecological economics, and neoclassical economics, and what can be considered as one unique factor that differentiates system dynamics from any other economic modeling method. So these two questions, of course, I'd like you to think about and tell me what you think maybe at the end of the presentation, since they are going back at the conclusion. So hope you have suggestions for me as well. So ERRE background system boundaries. So first of all, where the model starts from, it starts from the World3 model. As I said, my first paper came in 2015, was a calibration of World3-2003 model. Jürgen Randers looked at that, he was happy, so I felt like it was a good start of my PhD. So for those who don't know the limits of growth, just quickly, it is a global model, very much aggregated. It doesn't include any finance. The reason why is they want to keep it simple. They just want to show very quickly that finite worlds, that is materially finite, cannot allow the economy to grow forever materially as well. So what the system does is that they put the industrial system at the base of everything. The system, the entire dynamic is based on two reinforcing loops. One is the population growth and one is the industrial growth, which of course generated the exponential growth in the system over time. And unfortunately, the reinforcing loop dominate the simulation for the beginning from the beginning to the simulation to a certain point. At some point, there's a shift in loop dominance, which generates that the limits, which are pollution, land, and resources, the balancing loop becomes stronger than the reinforcing loop, generating the system to collapse. So in this particular model, what we thought could be good for us to build up is that we didn't feel like modeling pollution the same way. We actually didn't feel that the resources, minerals, and everything could be considered as limits. But we start looking at the problem of impact assessment models as they are today, which are climate change and fossil fuels and green energy, for looking at the energy transition. So from that, what we took was the land sector, and we tried to take it and integrate that into the model of John Sterman of his PhD thesis. So now going to the second model, as I said, Sterman 1981. So Sterman 1981 came from, the god of system dynamics, let's say, the Forrester. So after Limits of Growth, it was published in 1972, he starts working on the economic modeling of the US economy, and that's what became the System Dynamics National Model. And over time, he took one PhD at a time and created more PhD and more leader in the System Dynamics community, of course. So 75, there was Nathaniel Maas, who looked at the business cycle with a national model. 78, got the PhD Peter Senji, looking at the investment function and doing comparison with the econometric analysis. 1981, the model of John Sterman, that he was looking a lot about energy transition. And then 1987, at least from what I know, James Hines, that was looking at interest rates. As I said, what we start from was the model of John Sterman. So this model can be found online, is available. So what he did, if we can summarize that very quickly, is that he used some of the structures of the System Dynamics national model. He developed, modeled completely the energy transition concept. So model energy market, retrofit of energy of the capital sector. He modeled conventional and unconventional energy, where to him unconventional was like is not what they mean today as renewable. I mean, renewable is infinite resources. To him, unconventional was less cheap oil. So after the 1970s peak oil in the United States, they had to move from cheap oil to something more expensive. And that's what they mean as unconventional energy. And then model the OPEC sector to test the different strategies. So the study was to look at the impact of energy transition to the inflation of the US. So very important question. So what we did in this particular case, we took for doing the ERRE model, all the sector, but excluding the OPEC, since of course we want to do a global model, it was not necessary to assume like a different country or region that competes with my model really. So just to give a short description of the key differences between the two models. So apart from adding the food system, apart from moving the unconventional to renewable, and apart from adding the climate system, the difference comes from the purpose of the model. So of course it was focused on the long term. So we didn't really need to take care of shocks in the system in any case. It was looking at the energy transition. So in my case, instead, it was also interested in the short and long term. So I want a model that could catch both. I need to address the shocks, resilience, and risk. That was one of the key elements. It didn't have much interest in finance. That in my case, instead, was pretty significant. So making sure that the system could be represented in national accounting system or things like that. I didn't have particular interest in economic theory. I mean, I was looking at the energy transition, as I said. Instead, myself, in particular through my postdoc at the CASP project, I was looking a lot about the economic theory. It was, as I said, very important to build up a narrative for changing the way policymakers do things. So I ended up looking at behavioral, evolutionary, ecological, post-Keynesian, and basically also neoclassical economics. Then it was interested in energy transition, and in case was interested not only in energy transition, but also looking at all the limits of the world, and particularly looking at that in the idea of interaction between limits and finance. So just overview, top level system boundaries. On the left and right side, you see what I consider exogenous in this model. So in particular, population dynamics, technology, labor productivity dynamics, kind of like exogenous is simply a curve that starts from the beginning to the end of the simulation. So I don't try to model population as the limits of growth at all. Also other type of shocks on the right side, such as tax changes or money creation, interest rates, would actually be changed exogenously if we want once. So the core of the system is about modeling the economy, modeling the bank, the public sector, such as a government or whatever you can consider something that takes taxes and provides basically subsidies and expenditure. And then there are the world limits, which are imposed by climate, land availability, and resource discovery. So key equations in the model include prices, labor market, debt, wages, interest rate, energy market. And basically, what happens is that the bank can just create money and bring it in the system, generate more debt out of the money created out of nothing. And basically that's how the system interact among each other. The same perspective can be seen as a network. So the same model can be thought of as a network in multi-layer network. So at the top level, you can think of the client, household, banks, and public, which interact with the firms. The firms are technically composed as a supply chain, where each sector produces in a closed loop economy stuff for all the other people. And the entry system itself can be considered as itself like a small competition market where I put fossil fuels, renewables, and biofuels connect from each other, where biofuels, of course, come from agriculture, such that they could allow to look at the impact of, for example, energy on agriculture or vice versa. So the ERRE model follows a very modular approach. The principle of boundary rationality is accounted and boundary source limits, and assumes a standard financial structure of trade-off payments, such as stock and flow, and physically, such as stock and flow consistency of the economy, which is very important for calibration purposes when one are looking at national accounting systems. So, for example, down here you can see an example of the balance sheet of a firm into the model. So each of the sector pretty much has the same approach of asset and liabilities into themselves. So after we look a little bit of the top level view of the system, I want to go into the economic theory. That I think is what should matter as well for many systems model are interested in doing economics. So the first one I'm going to talk about, so like 2 slides per each, is the behavioral economics aspect. So behavioral economics means trying to look at the psychology of people, how they react to one particular shock linearly or non-linearly. So one of the key elements which defines our approach to behavioral economics is, in my view, the anchor adjustment. So the anchor adjustment is so fundamental for System Dynamics. The way it works in this particular case is that on the left side, a lot of different sides of the company can ask for some particular money. So they have desired payments for capital due to the right amount of asset you want to generate, the demand you want to achieve, or the right amount of labor for producing as much you want, how much taxes you need to pay for the government, things like that. So these desired payments get summed up on the top side when they get desired payments in total. They create then a reference condition, the desired liquidity, and that desired liquidity is compared as a ratio with the liquidity. So of course, the point is to control the liquidity, and the liquidity can never go below 0. It's so important. And what happens is the following, that the liquidity, depending on the ratio between liquidity and desired liquidity, all the table function that you can see on the right somehow link back to each one of the input that you get on the left side. So for example, if you take the first one on the left of the table function, the effect of financial decision on capital payments in this particular case means that if the liquidity is beyond, so the stock of liquidity is beyond the desired liquidity, it means that the multiplier will be 1, and as a result, it will allow the desired payments to go as much as they need to be. Instead, if the liquidity is below the desired liquidity, we start following the nonlinear relationship until the point in which if I have no liquidity at all, I will have to create a multiplier by 0, which generates no payment of anything at all, so no investment in any way. So this slide, I think, is quite important. I hope what I said makes things clear. You can come back here later if you want to, unless you have any questions. So next slide is also, this element of anchor adjustment is used definitely in the financial system. So how the model work for controlling the cash flows in the system. Technically, if you start looking at the interaction of components into the firm sector, so you start seeing that you have the hiring of labor, you buy energy, you manage the inventory, and pretty much each and every one of the relationships that are inside of this particular model follow a similar approach. They always have some sort of anchor and adjustment, or a nonlinear relationship which basically link one particular variable to another one. And this is what makes the model very much linked to behavioral economics, in particular looking at the limited cognitive capabilities that influence feedback processes and decision-making into the model. So after behavioral, we can speak about evolutionary. So why the model is evolutionary? So when I start looking at the concept of evolutionary economics, I start thinking that the evolutionary means out of equilibrium, right? So it looked like that you just need to have a population growth in the system that the model can be considered as evolutionary. As well as technology change, that means that is evolution. Actually, that's of course not the case. So the main difference between, so I use the concept of evolutionary as the opposite almost of equilibrium type of economic modeling. So equilibrium modeling generally means that the balancing loop always wins against the reinforcing loop. And what happens is that whatever shock you put in the system at some point, the perturbation will go back to generate some sort of equilibrium and stability over time. And that's very, very, very important. Now, if you to that particular model, you add the population growth, of course, the model will always balance back to the new population. So that is not really the condition which makes the model evolutionary. What makes this model in particular evolutionary is the fact that there are structures that generates a new normal in the system. So if you look in particular at the price structure that I use here, this one follows what you can find in textbook as the hill climbing or floating type of structure, which is kind of a floating goal type of structure, really, where you can push the price up or down depending on the pressure that comes from whatever exogenous factor. So in particular, in this case, the price comes at the core between market forces, between costs, these are the two key factors, and at the end, these factors can create pressure on price, which is also dependent on some sort of perception delay dependent on the markets. So as a result, the set of parameters which depend that create this separation generates evolutionary price, what I would call, that allow the systems, the agents which interact in this system to adapt to a new normal when price changes. This is what will allow also the inflation to come up in this particular system, which is so important. What happens is that the system will evolve constantly towards an irreversible state from the past to the future. So this is a very important element of this model, but probably also more important, in particular for the stability of this particular system, is the way the wages have been modeled. So if the price generates inflationary pressures on wages, what happens is that since wages go back and increase the price again as a matter of cost increase, then you generate a positive feedback loop which generates nominal capital growth in the ERRE System Dynamics model, as well as in the Sterman one, since actually, in particular, the wage element is something I didn't touch from the model of John Sterman of the time. However, it is very important to recognize, and that's just a small but important element, that the benchmarking pressure across sectors, that is the third of the 5 effects which generates pressure on wages, it's probably one of the key elements which generate growth in the system, simply because when one, for example, increases the technology or generates some pressure for inflation into one particular sector in the economy, this pressure gets transported to all the other sectors based on that particular benchmark on wage sector, which of course is so important to generate growth in the system. And this is also one of the reasons which generate stability and inflation increase in this particular model. So that's why the model is considered evolutionary in my view. So now we go towards the other type of schools. Now we look at the post-Keynesian elements. So post-Keynesian theory practice is a school that exists since kind of a long time. So definitely after the 1970s, 80s, it took a lot of shape and the narrative became very clear. So Keynesian is, the economist from Cambridge University, and post-Keynesian basically took his idea of the public systems forward into the basically in today's world, really. So what they believe is a view that is very similar to evolutionary. They believe the world is not in equilibrium. They believe the world can go from past to the future in an irreversible state. They look for realism when they try to understand things. So they do not accept things like the equilibrium. So of course, that doesn't make sense for a post-Keynesian perspective to accept equilibrium. And one of the factors that make post-Keynesian so relevant is also the aspect of understanding money. So they really care about understanding of money into the economy. They just don't accept the fact that money can, have, for example, no effects when a money supply gets generated that have to have an effect on the real economy as well. So in this particular case, I'm showing the way the financial sector is built up. So that generates the money supply in this particular model. So on the bottom side, basically you have the real GDP, and what this model tend to do is to generate a money supply that tend to be as proportional to the real GDP, such that it generates growth. So growth generates further growth. And also that new money creation will generate a new debt money, so money out of nothing that basically is stored in the central bank. This money becomes more liquidity in the bank, and this liquidity can allow for having the ability for the bank to provide more loans. They create more pressure such that they can create more loans and give more money away to the economy. So the private sector, which is on the right, it can be both household or firms, can have a bit more money. That generates a bit more debt and a bit more assets. So since they have more assets, they can borrow more money as well. So that generates some sort of growth in the system. Okay? This is very important, the way in which this particular model works. Now, to demonstrate that this thing is a post-Keynesian, I provide a simple shock. So what I did, so what you can get into the appendix online is basically all the tests that you find during my PhD. And the way to do that was for me to start from making the model to start in complete perfect balance. So the model in total is about 5,000 equations, but if you make basically the calculations such that you get the flow in and flow out to balance out, and you remove population growth or technology growth, then you can make sure the system is a flat line. So what I did out of that flat line is to create a simple shock, just one shock in 2010, and see what happened. And what happened is the following, that as you can see from 2000 to 2010, you get a flat line for all of the variables, which is fine because that's how the system was made to be doing. But that particular shock, even if it is or below, so bringing this rate, basically take money out of the system or bring money into the system, even if it's just a shock that lasts for one finite amount of time, what really happens is that it generates a constant disequilibrium in the system. And most important, as post-Keynesian have, is that the money supply can generate impact on the real economy. So in the classical terms, equilibrium-based economics assumes that the change in money supply will increase both the availability of cash for the consumers at the same time, such that since they are rational, they know exactly what they're doing, and they will automatically generate an inflationary pressure, which will increase the prices, and nothing will actually change in the economy. So the price will maybe double up if they double up the money supply, but the real economy will produce exactly the same because there are no money in the system. The post-Keynesian instead they say, no, actually, put the money in the system, you see that, for example, labor can change. So in this particular case, the E chart is total employment. As you can see, it definitely impacted by this particular shock. The wages get inflated over time. Then there is this effect, the D, financial sector leverage for growth, which basically means how much money the bank can lend or can push. So that particular push that is activated and keep flowing money into the system. That of course creates an imbalance, which increases more or less the inflation, for example, if the inflation goes up, and can impact more loans and more savings as well. So the reason why this is post-Keynesian is because you can see that money shock can impact the real economy as well. So going towards the why ecological, why ecological, of course, is obvious in the sense that as far as you model the environments, you must be ecological somehow. And in particular, we look at the long-term the long-term negative feedback effect from the environment. So in this particular case, I model climate structure, which is super simple, 3 stocks. So it's not really a climate model at all. Or the character structure, that's on the right side is what came up from the World3, that when you adapt it to the Sterman idea, and that becomes pretty much that thing. So to give an example of simulation, for example, this is the run that you can get out of Sterman thesis that actually kind of inherited of my model because of his model. So what I was doing here is to test again. So this one is also in the appendix. You can just go take it. So to test the depletion scenario of energy. So I first put the model in this equilibrium such that I put, I think, population growth going up. So in fact, all the economy basically start increasing for whatever reason. Resources goes up, fossil fuel shipment goes up. So basically there's an imbalance. There is more demand, so it must grow. But then I apply 4 scenarios. The first one is that I start including the depletion element, which basically generates a bit of collapse of the economy, of course, because if you sensitize the system to sensitize the system to the fact that it should collapse, it will definitely. That's what the model does. And then I applied 3 other sectors, 3 other shocks, which I assumed like the fossil fuel technology increase. And then I applied the green tech increase, and then I assumed like a shift in the market. So basically there are 3 parameters which actually determine that the fossil fuel sector can produce more. So starting the scenario 2, for example, the ERRE, it is a very important indicator. I believe many people who do energy modeling should know. ERRE is the energy return on energy invested. It's very much debated in the UK at least. The ERRE grows because I assume that fossil fuel technology will increase, which means they can produce a bit more, so which increase the ERRE. But when the depletion comes, the ERRE collapses as well, creating like a destruction of the fossil fuel industry together with the entire economy. And so basically, every more green tech and green shift generates a bit less dependency of the real economy from the fossil fuel sector, and that's generating fact. So if you look at the chart A, this is the real GDP, the scenario in which I assume both green shift and green tech is not exactly a collapse of the economy. Actually, it's not doing too bad. It's having big troubles, but not too bad. Of course, price change go up because it's the depletion scenario, and the shortfall goes up, and pretty much that's how this scenario does. That's how the model is trigger collapse due to depletion in this particular case. And then the question is, why also is neoclassical? So this one, of course, was a big problem for me in the sense that starting from a sustainability type of concept, I didn't really want the model to be neoclassical, but the model is neoclassical, so I have to really tell that. In particular, if one wants to add or remove that particular structure, it is important to know that there are few factors to generate that neoclassical element. So one is the fact that the household sector has a utility function that generates some sort of demand going up over time. And secondly, that the Cobb-Douglas and the constant plus the constant elasticity of substitution formulation is used both for production function and both for the household utility. And this is kind of the standard for a neoclassical model, so we have to admit that. In reality, we can say that even if the equation has its own properties, that's not entirely the reason why this can be considered as a neoclassical model. What makes this neoclassical is the fact that we have a balancing feedback. So the number 3, that's touch both capital and the labor investments, assuming a constant marginal productivity of each of the input factors. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with that, but that constant marginal productivity, which is nice because it creates stability in the systems, in reality can not always be correct in the sense that let's say, is a nice addition which allows the system to go where you really want it to go. But in practice, that might not be real. So it should be nice that it's real, but might not be. And if you go in the pictures below, this one can be found in the appendix. You can just go, if you can't see well the text, that's not supposed to be at the moment. But if you go in the appendix and you will find these 2 pictures, then you will know where this model should be changed if you want not to make it neoclassical. A 4th element is the fact that we have a capital charge rates structure, which is based on an optimal type of rational thinking of neoclassical economics. That also linked to the circle on the bottom right, but you can go and look at the equation in the appendix. And the other element is the fact that technology growth follows the standard solo growth model. And that's on the top right. When we model the labor productivity, that's completely exogenous. That's how the solo did that, at least that's what one of the reasons he's famous for. So, ERRE model and the economic theory. So what is very important is that with stock and flows, we can model everything. So every quantitative economic modeling approach can be applied with stock and flows. In my experience, I found myself that many people, when they see system dynamics, they see stock and flows. They don't understand what there's deep inside of it. They pretend that stock and flows means really, they summarize basically system dynamics with that. But in practice, in the ERRE model, you can see there's 5 schools of economics: behavioral, evolutionary, post-Keynesian, ecological, and classical. And the reason why is because of the behavioral is the nonlinear human behavior. Evolutionary is the path dependencies in the system, which depends on this sort of irreversible evolutionary aspect. Post-Keynesian, you may view the key element is the monetary policy. Ecological, because of the ecological limits and negative nonlinear feedback effect. And neoclassical, as I said, for some optimal assumptions, production utility function, technology change. Now, this last slide is simply like trying to catch the last question that I put. So this is really the last slide. So what makes system dynamics different from the other type of economic modeling? And that's a question I try to ask myself kind of a long time, because of course, as an experienced modeler, you learn over time, you end up in troubles when you speak to economists that are not familiar with system dynamics. And as a result, we can definitely say that, yes, system dynamics is stock and flows, but pretty much every other single economic modeling method is also stock and flows, including equilibrium modeling, including post-Keynesian, anything basically can be built up in stock and flows. And there's a second element, which I don't know, I could make this more interactive. I could ask people if you want to tell me what the second element is. Just in simple terms, in my view, that element is the nonlinearity. So when I had to explain what system dynamics is different from other people, talking about it, nonlinearity became like the key factor. That's what really makes the difference, in my view, because the nonlinearity, the way in which nonlinearity is used, is way to quantify the feedback loops. So quantify the strengths of the feedback loop, which is a very different thing than what all the people I heard were so doing. So and this is very, very important in my view, and I hope you agree with that. If you don't, please let me know. So just to conclude, the big problem is that different economic school of thoughts fight among each other at the ontological level because they want to influence policymaking. They are based on different assumptions. So different theories means different, no agreement among each other most often. Since system dynamics modeling overlap with all of them, there is a risk, in particular, if one, rather than being the master of the method, is mastered by it, can generate fundamental disagreements in itself. So the model can have disagreement in itself. So if I put my model and put that variable for some kind of people, they will not agree because maybe there are some classical elements. Some other people will tell me, no, I don't agree because there's behavior I don't like, things like that. And my view, just my humble view, I can say, it is the sole responsibility of the system dynamics modeler to really know, to engage with economic modeling and to know which are the correct narrative we engage with that particular school of thought, such that we can move from an attempt to influence policy that is nice and smooth to maybe something that can end up something like this. The elephant among those who don't know what the element is all about. So thank you very much. This is my preference. If you have any question or any comment, please, I'm very happy to hear all about that.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So there has been a question in the chat, but I wasn't so sure because you talked about post-Keynesian monetary theory. And so the question is in regards to why system dynamics can be considered as agreeing with more schools of economics. And the question was, does that include modern monetary theory?
Excuse me, did you read this is your question, right?
No, this is a question in the chat. I don't know if the person would like to unmute themselves because I'm not sure if you wanted to post this anonymously.
Okay, so the why systems can be considered agreeing with all of the schools is simply because of the structure that we put in the system. So some elements of system dynamics methods, such as nonlinearity or feedback, or the anchor adjustment generates tells that we can speak about ourselves as behavioral economists if we want to. Monetary policy and this focus on the reality can tell we are also post-Keynesian economists. Ecological, because we model environments and so on. So pretty much these are the five schools that I want to put, evolutionary for that reason. But at the same time, it is important that, so technically, as I was trying to say, I can remove all of the nonlinear relationship for if I want. I can bring the price system as like, remove that particular structure or the wages, and make that to become an equilibrium model. And the big I think, challenge there, or the big problem can be that one person can end up being an equilibrium modeler and call themselves as a system dynamics modeler, or vice versa. And I feel that is kind of an important element. So I think some people can do that. So people have ideas that even to tell me that I'm not right, that I'm very happy to hear that. So on the side of the monetary, I am not economist, so if my is so on the Modern monetary theory. So the modern monetary theory, thank you, John Rodat, for asking that. So I'm not really familiar with that in the sense that what I tried to do was to, try to demonstrate why this approach can be considered as like agreeing with post-Keynesian economics, in particular in relation to the way in which you can put money in the system. So that's a kind of a standard approach for a post-Keynesian to demonstrate that his model is not neoclassical, for example. So modern monetary theory, as I said, I'm not an economist by background, but in practice, of course, as I said, as far as that modern monetary economics is made in stock and flows, continuous time, we can model that using this type of software. If that monetary economy is more about trying to model networks, we can probably use some slightly different approach, but still we can consider that as being part of it. Yeah, so pretty much that's it. The question I also want to interrupt. Okay, no rush. So sorry I didn't pick the question straight away after receiving it. So I bring now Micha. Micha says, I'm trying to understand the source of real per capita economic growth. We are using Sol's model, but his paper found that the quantities of capital and labor were far less important than exogenous technical change. So is your concept of growth exogenous, relying on exogenous technical change? So I can tell you, if you go into the appendix, you will find all the tests possible, because what I did was to put the system in equilibrium and then check. For example, apply population growth and see what happened. And population already generates increasing demand and then generate growth. Technology. So I apply the technology growth as well. And what in the system, what this thing really does is that it pushes the ability of one particular sector to supply more. Since we have a price system that is based on this pressure between supply and demand, since the supply increases a little bit, generates the price to go down. Because if you have a bit more production than before, you have sufficient, you have more stuff to supply, then the price starts decreasing. So the technology will start making the price to go down. And as far as the price goes down for the for each of the sector, which use this marginal cost and productivity for ordering more capital assets, then we find that meaningful to buy more capital because the price goes down. As a result, they buy more stuff and that generates the growth in the system. And that's how the model actually works.
So if I can come back on that.
Yeah.
So what you're saying, I'm not talking about population growth because we're talking about per capita real economic growth here. So you're basically relying on external technological change, external technical change, which is mediated, as you say, through the price system and incentives to invest. But the kind of moving force behind that is exogenous technical change. Am I right in that interpretation?
So in practice, this presentation, to keep it in 30 minutes, I just made half of the full thing that I was meant to be doing. And the other half is basically the simulation, all the shock, all the thing that I put there. So the exogenous elements that I had there, if you want to set them one by one, you can find them in the documents. So one is the technology that, as I said, generate this sort of dynamic. So generate growth because price goes down. So generate deflation and increase the productivity. The other element which is very important to generate growth in the system, and that's the nominal one, is the money supply. So in the moment in which you start generating, push the money, so exogenously again, push more money in the system, you can generate the inflation to go up again. That goes very similar to monetary theory at that point. So it's a very interesting probably element. When you put them together, you can generate a calibration in the system such that you can match both the real economic growth and both the inflation growth. So these are two elements. So to answer your question, yes, the technology growth generates system growth here. but that due to the feedback effect that I was describing before. If that's clear, anything, Mike, if you want to.
I think that's as far as we can go. I think.
Yeah,
I'll have a further look at your model. Thank you.
Yes, please, anytime. If you want to catch me on email, I'm here to answer them. So then I have John Rodott again. MMT is really a subset. MMT, I believe, modern monetary theory, subset that in today's environment speaks primarily to issues of government debt. For governments that issue their own money, see Calton, the deficit limit. So in practice, the element of money creation. So I can tell that this model is quite weak. So I improved the model of Sterman in this particular aspect, but I can tell it's still weak to explain the modern monetary theory as we were talking about. So for example, quantitative easing, money creation, the central bank buy the government debt, the government has more money they can spend. So all of these elements are not captured in the system, but it is possible to, of course, add them up. And I'd like to do more work on that. We'll see how that goes. So yeah, then we have Daniel Harter. The model is large and comprehensive. Was it hard to parameterize and justify those parameters? What about aggregation? You mentioned ABM, but does this explode the data requirements which must be justified? Thank you, that's a very good question, Daniel. So as I said, my particular path was the following. I started trying to put limits to growth in an agent-based model from a friend of mine. He was working at Logo. At some point, this combination didn't become possible at all. So what I tried to do was to, also because my model became large, as you see, I mean, it's about 4,000, 5,000 equations. So parameterize this thing became quite complicated. And the more I was working with that, the more it could become complicated, particularly when you increase the size. So I end up oversimplifying even a certain aspect in comparison to what I started from in the Sterman model. And the explosion in data requirements. So I can tell you that after I finished with this thing, I was working to create a multi-country model. And but to move to that type of approach, and that what became also the extra shock element, that's what I kept it aside for a while, is basically a model that I moved from Vensim to Ventity. And the reason why is because I'm not sure if people are familiar with Ventity as a software, but it basically, if you think about my system as, you know, this network approach with all the boxes and the sectors, they become entities, and you can play with them as much as you like. It becomes simply much easier to pull one sector in or out, or test one sector singularly, or things like that. That simplifies a lot of stuff. So I've been working in Ventity since at least 2 years now, and I achieved like a multi-country system dynamics model, which can be used with also the trade among countries, which is very nice. And that potentially can be also thought a bit as an agent-based model, in the sense that, in my view, agent-based model is mostly dependent on events and actions. So the agents are things that take actions and that respond to some sort of events, which are maybe dependent on the environment or interaction with the other agents. So to me, action events are fundamental, and Ventity also allows for the action events type of thinking to take place. And potentially that could help as well. It's much easier also to put the data in the system, things like that. Then I have John Rodott. So Daniel, if I did say anything, please let me know. John, Roberto's effort is ambitious, and now I have to add another book to my desk. Applause. Oh, thank you, John. Thank you. I'm happy you like it. If you get in the ebook, is much less expensive. So I wasn't expecting that it's $160 per copy, but thank you. And remember to use the online appendix. That's fundamental. I mean, all the model is there. The book is basically the description of why things have been doing in a certain particular way. looking forward to part 2. Thank you, Silel. Yeah, I mean, part 2, I don't know, that's depending on Christine. I'm happy to present if you want to.
Yes.
In the summer semester, I'm not sure, and yeah, okay, that will be with faculty and cost economics and everything. Okay, so yeah, I'm happy to answer any other question. I don't know what's the time now. Yeah, it's 9, so probably is the time for you to go do your other meetings and things. I don't know if I want to keep you more. Also very good. I'm very happy to have attracted people like, for example, Khalid Sahid, who sent a couple of emails a while ago. And very good to hope you find this interesting. And yeah, it would be lovely to see everybody in the face. Wow, it looks like it's not going to be possible.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We are a few minutes past the hour, but if you have some time, and if the people still have questions, oh, Daniel asked a question, I'm free, so I can stay a few more minutes.
Okay, the limits of growth face a lot of opposition. Did you experience this from economists? Oh, wow. So, I mean, luckily from my side, in the book also, you have a foreword from Jürgen Randers. So Jürgen Randers was happy with this work. So in my particular case, since we work in the CASP, Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, among each other, of course, we were agreeing with the limits of growth. So we had all parties parliamentary group influencing constantly the UK Parliament decision. And the all parliament group was named on the limits of growth. So that's very important to recognize. So I cannot tell you I had a lot of opposition from economists simply because I didn't speak much with them actually. Through ExoShock, actually, I had a lot of problem because, you know, this ExoShock thing I built up was, I mean, it was technically lucky once I had to get funding to do more work with this model, if not, it could have been complicated. And to do that, I had to do this ExoShock thing. And this allowed me to also go talk to companies and say, look, what you think, look at this model, what you want to be doing. And of course, that was terrible to try to understand that they don't really care about any long-term type of decision. So even like pension manager, they want to do forecasting for the max of the 12 months, which is insane. And I found myself in the position of what am I doing? So as I said, at the moment I'm participating in this large protocol EAST, like economics of energy innovation, system transitions, and we are just expanding completely. So we are using kind of post-Keynesian economics as probably the core of the economic theory underneath the system. We are comparing like 20 models, and the one comparing the 20 models, it's come from India, China, Brazil, and then I will put my model as well forward, seeing the difference between my model and the others. So definitely we can face opposition, but that's not dependent just on economics. It's dependent on, you know, how the reality works. People are short term; they're not long term, and you just have to find the right policymaker that support you and believes in the work you're doing. And that's what we're trying to do. And that's, I mean, hopefully we are going to get something good out of it. Yeah. So really, thank you very much for asking me to give the presentation. I'm very happy I could get some interest from people. And there's much more we can talk. Thank you. There's much more we can talk about this book. I mean, this book, as I said, I gave you just a glimpse. I mean, if you go through the book itself, should be about 300 pages at least. And, you know, one part is just limits to growth modeling. So two chapters are just on the limits to growth. I try to explain that using the nonlinear relationship, which is something that wasn't done neither by Dennis Meadows, for example, or Jorgen. Then a chapter is about economic theory, you just want to know economic theory, and then the model itself. But the appendix then is so important because I was so happy to put it available online for free for everybody, and it's 250 pages. So you have all the material you want there. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Mike, as well for introducing me. It was very, very nice. for your thoughts. Hope you find this interesting as well.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for your willingness to do this.
Fantastic. Yeah, hope we can chat sometime, you know, when you came. Okay.
Okay.
So guys, thank you very much for everything. I believe I have to let you go now.
Thank you. Hope to see some of you next week or maybe next month for our next meeting. So we have weekly meetings at WPI, but every month we try to host an economics meeting. Thank you.
Fantastic. Awesome. I will stay in the loop.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye everyone. Thank you very much for joining.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Stop share.
I'll stop.